Sounds good.
And we can spend a couple minutes just kind of hanging out and saying hello to all the comrades joining us. I see we're joined by Speedrun News Network. Hello, Ken. All right.
There it is.
Gonna kind of.
Oh dear.
I'll just ask the people in the chat right now if I'm talking and Izzy and Kyle are both talking. Can you hear all three of us? I'm still kind of novice at this stream software, so you know, we're gonna spend a little time.
Microphone checks.
Woo! Let's I guess see if it's working. Can anyone hear me? That is the real question.
Is anybody out there?
I'm gonna try something. All right. How about now? Go ahead and talk a little bit because I just changed one of the settings.
Can anybody hear me? Hello, hello. Hi.
Hello, friendos. How do you do? I have a problem. I didn't think that would be gone that fast.
Speedrun says they can't hear us.
They can't hear?
Oh, no!
I don't know what's going on with that.
Just OBS being OBS, really?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Well, Izzy and I tested it out and yesterday, and we didn't seem to have any major problems. But we'll.
Okay, they're saying it was better before.
Oh, it was better before. Okay, I'm gonna change that setting again, and then we'll get going. All right, go ahead and give it another shot, comrades.
Hello, is anyone there? Can they? Well, I know they're there, but can they hear me? Am I there? That's the real question.
Yeah, is everything okay? Chat, hit us up. Let us know.
Hit us with a 1 in the chat if you can hear us.
Press F for our stream.
Rip. Okay. Well, we've got some folks here already, and we're just hit the 4:30 mark, so I'm gonna switch us over to my cool intermission screen and start reading the script. So, hello everybody joining us. This is our basically like a public live stream reading group hosted by myself, A World to Win. Simba unfortunately couldn't join us today. Izzy Does Everything and laborkyle. We're going to be discussing a selection from Kim Moody's 2017 book On New Terrain, How Capital is Reshaping the Battleground of Class War, with our special guest, the retired professor of Marxist economics, Youseff Khodaparast, graduate of the New School for Social Research. On New Terrain is a book about the changes in capital-labor relations in the United States over the last several decades and how the political landscape has shifted and been shaped by those changes. Kim Moody is a labor activist, co-founder of the Labor Notes newsletter, which can be found at labornotes.org. It's a really excellent website. I would strongly suggest checking it out. We're going to be focusing on a particular selection from this book. We're not going to be talking about the entire book. We're just focused on chapters 8 through 10, which focus on how the economics of the U.S. electoral system, namely the dramatically expanded role that big business now has on both of the major political parties here. So before we dive into it, I'm going to switch over to screen capture here, and we're all going to go around and introduce ourselves. Maybe I think it would be good to do your name, your pronouns, your YouTube channel if you have one, your political ideology if you should so choose, and yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Just a second. Let me make sure I'm not totally messing things up here. Okay, I think I got it. All right, we got Skype. So I'll start. I'm Melody. My channel is called A World to Win. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a self-identified Marxist-Leninist.
I'm Youseff Khodaparast, as was mentioned before, a retired professor. And academically or intellectually, I describe myself as a Marxist. Politically, I'm a socialist. And I'm very glad to be here.
Oh, okay. I'm Elizabeth. You can call me Izzy. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an anarcho-communist with like heavy Marxist leanings. So I have a YouTube channel called Izzy Does Everything, where I used to do story times and vlogs, but I grew to hate making them, so I switched over to propaganda and shit posts.
The good shit. My name is Kyle. I am in Florida right now. My pronouns are he and him. I am a graduate student of history at a gigantic state university that will not be named. But you can very easily find it on my Twitter account because I complain about them quite a bit. I study my personal study is really about manifestations of antiquity in modernity, particularly in the European far right. That's my personal interest in what I typically write about. But politically, I'm going to basically paraphrase our special guest here. I politically identify myself as a socialist, but am very explicitly Marxist in both my political and my academic ideologies, and don't subscribe to a particular tendency, but have a tendency to waffle between sort of vanguardist party politics as well as trade unionism, because I also do labor organizing on the side. So yeah, it's complicated, I guess, so to speak. But yeah, that's me.
All right. So with that, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to hand things over to Kyle to summarize the first kind of part of the book, to kind of contextualize the part that we selected. So and then we're the three of us are going to summarize the selections, the three chapters that we selected from this book, and then we're going to discuss them. So without any further ado, take it away, Kyle.
Sounds great. So in general, On New Terrain is, as Melody was summarizing very effectively earlier, a book about growth and change under capitalism, and more specifically, the ways in which changes in the capitalist mode of production, as well as the capitalist economy, affect the working class directly, and in many ways, sort of vice versa, how the working class then in turn affect capitalists and owners. What Moody is really trying to do is situate the neoliberal project, so in the late 1970s and the early 1980s in the United States, within the rest of the history of capitalism in a very active way. He's trying to come to an understanding of a current diagnosis of our problems, and then to essentially offer some potential solutions. And the way that he does so is especially through Marx's writings around capital accumulation. It's sort of his main mode of engagement. Especially, I think it's in part 7 of the first volume of Capital. It's just called The Process of Capital Accumulation. Basically, he wants us to understand the way that in real time, capitalism's inner workings reflect how the concentration of wealth, the motive to further that concentration and that profit, as well as the necessary exploitation of workers in order to further those goals, have repeatedly throughout the history of capitalism reinforced capital's own power, while continuing to further alienate workers who make up all that money. And essentially, to put it simply, we've recently come out of a recession, the Great Recession as they're calling it, and we've noticed, I'm sure all of us have, that wages have stayed very, very low for the working class, while the wealthy has been able to both grow their wealth as well as to continue to concentrate it in fewer and fewer hands, essentially. So capitalism is really, it's an active idea that's about change and alteration. And it's something that happens throughout time. And he's essentially just trying to take those ideas and put them within the late 20th and early 21st century context. So basically, in terms of capital accumulation, which is a big part of the first section of this book, I'll summarize the sections in a quick second, but I wanted to talk about this. Essentially, Marx is demonstrating the inevitable results of a wage labor system where capitalists own things, and then we work for the capitalists in exchange for a wage, and they take the profits. And that sort of standard idea is that capitalism is always continuing in further reproducing both the workplace conditions that we find ourselves in, so exploitation of workers, and then for the benefits of capitalists, as well as to essentially reinforce its own principles, its own laws, that sort of a thing. I've heard it said before, capitalism follows its own rules and follows its own laws. And essentially, Moody is trying to illustrate how this has changed and shifted after the 1980s. I think Marx said every accumulation becomes the means of new accumulation. And that's basically what's happening here. As workers are producing more than they're paid, essentially they're producing more money for the owner than they're paid in a wage, the extra profit from that exploitation of workers is concentrated in the hands of capitalists, who then turn around and use it not to distribute among workers, very rarely, but to expand their means for making money. And this happens even more aggressively in times of surplus, so when capitalists have extra money. Essentially, they're looking to reinvest that money into more things that will produce capital for them. And what that does, according to Marx and according to Moody, is reproduces the spirit of capitalism, which is about exploitation of workers, the further profiteering of individual capitalists, as well as all this other stuff that isn't necessarily a part of the book, but all this other stuff that we internalize as workers during that process. But the idea is just basically to say that the way that capitalism engages in the economic sphere and in our workplaces has a tendency to change over time, and sometimes it does so very rapidly. It's moving, it's reinforcing itself using its own profits. So as people make more money, they turn around and invest it back so they can continue to make money. And in particular, and this is definitely where Moody comes in, especially after the rise of neoliberalism, we start to see that there are these patterns. Well, this happened before, but it's very striking now. There are these patterns of recession, crisis, and then there's an ebb and flow of capital. During recession, there's not as much capital. Essentially, there's crisis, and then there's recovery afterward. during those periods of recovery, we start to see the concentration of wealth from the most wealthy people to continue to go up, while wages for working people stay very, very low. And that's essentially what he's arguing is a further duplication of this process of capital accumulation, and that ultimately it teaches us a lot and tells us a lot about our current moment within the lens of what we call historical materialism, or a way to look at history between the conflicts between the classes. Moody is essentially trying to show how not only after neoliberalism, individual capitalists have changed the way that they're accumulating wealth, but that has also caused a change within the makeup of the working class. And it's forced leftists and trade unionists and just the working class more generally to realign its strategy, or will require that, in order to address more contemporary problems. But these problems are grounded in a historically materialist view of history. It's the what did Lukács say? It's an intellectual synthesis of social existence, I think. It fundamentally changes the way that we have to engage in our world. And that's, I think, the really key part to Moody's text. Sorry I went on so long. I'll summarize just right now, basically. The capitalist mode of production is reproducing and changing itself. Then the internal structures of the classes are also reproduced and changed. And it requires us to examine why this happened, and also potentially what we could do about it. So in part one, Moody, part one's called Remaking of the U.S. Working Class, and it's basically about what I just described, this process of reconfiguration of the working class as a reflection of capital accumulation after neoliberalism. One of the chapters is called Roots of Change. He breaks apart sort of existing arguments around like U.S. economic history after the 80s, like the rate of imports and offshoring as evidence of a decline in U.S. manufacturing, but instead argues more closer to his central thesis and pushes back against those sort of scholarly ideas. He also does so through discussing precarious the types of work that I'm very familiar with, so like the so-called economy, which basically he says that there's been a lot of growth there, but it's not quite
Oh dear.
in those spaces.
Kyle, we're losing your audio a bit. I don't know what's up with that.
Oh, damn it. Is it any better now? What would we say?
Yeah, it's pretty good right now.
Yeah.
Just Skype being Skype, I guess.
God being said, I guess, yeah. Well, the internet is supposed to be pretty good, so hopefully it'll keep holding up. But just stop me if it continues to be shitty. But yeah, and the last part of the first section talks about the growing diversity and change present within the working class. He pulls out a lot of really useful and interesting numbers about the increase in the percentage of service employees who are racial minorities as well as immigrants. And is citing it as this sort of refiguring of the working class under changing conditions, as exploitation has forced the global South to essentially immigrate, like mass migration has forcefully reconfigured the working class in the way that we see it. So that's the first part. The second part, which is it's titled "The Changing Terrain of Class Struggle," is essentially talking about, just as it describes, the terrain in which class struggle can occur is altering and changing quite a bit over the past, say, 20 or 30 years. He talks about the consolidation of major industry through big mergers, which is something that's been happening a lot recently. Think like the auto industry. He also talks about what he calls the supply chain gang, which I thought was great. The essentially clusters of logistics that are centered around certain areas, mostly urban areas. So that's transportation and like communication, like your mail and how you get packages and stuff, are all sort of concentrating themselves in certain places. And then the third thing he talks about is essentially what he calls a potential coming up surge, and he puts a question mark at the end of it, which I think is appropriate. And he uses strike waves and growth in union membership to try and track the process of accumulation, because principally the process of accumulation and the times of crisis coincide with also crisis from the working class too. So when everyone gets really pissed off, that stuff is going very poorly. And so he uses a strike waves, sort of trying to map them, track them. He literally graphs them, and then union growth as indicative of his central thesis. And then the chapter that comes before what we're going to discuss today is essentially reading tea leaves regarding Donald Trump, and not in a bad way, in a good way. He's essentially trying to contextualize the rise of Donald Trump in the sort of changing in American political American political party, and sort of takes the, for lack of a better term, feckless neoliberal response from Democrats, and uses it to talk about why Donald Trump maybe wasn't an inevitability, but he's not as much of an aberration as I have a tendency to think that he is. And I think that brings us up to speed. And sorry for going on so long.
No, that was an excellent summary, Kyle. So we're I think now, Izzy, that brings us to your turn to summarize chapter 8. Yeah, please take us away.
Oh dear, this is a terrible time to say that I have to go to the restroom, isn't it?
That's okay. That's okay. You do that, and we'll unpack a little bit of what Kyle just put forward there. Youseff, do you have any comments on that?
What we just heard was a great classic description of capitalist economic development in general. With respect to capital accumulation, I have to say, which we all know, it is directly connected to economic crises. And I think, obviously, one of those crises have led to the election of Donald Trump. And what that is when capitalist accumulation continues to grow, this urge to produce, to accumulate, results in, as we all know, overproduction at some times. And these overproduction results in obviously layoffs, getting rid of the labor. And as these events occur over time, then another crisis will emerge, followed by the crisis of overproduction. That is the crisis of underconsumption, as we know. So, as these masses of workers are being laid off due to overproduction, as prices fall, as factories scale back their production, as capitalists try to save a buck or two here and there, then wages decline, masses of workers get laid off, and then total effective demand, I think this term is a Keynesian term, which is in line really with the Marxist analysis of underconsumption. So this period in the process of underconsumption, which seldom many mainstream economists point out, often lead to major economic crisis. In my opinion, this is what happened that led to the election of Donald Trump. That is falling income, stagnating wages,
Right.
and declining productivity, which obviously internally encouraged capital flight.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to, I'll just pick up kind of where you left off and then hand things over to Izzy, which is Moody and Kyle, maybe you can also reflect on this a little bit. Moody in that first part of the book actually talks about how there's kind of there's a bit of a mythology around, the decline of manufacturing in the United States because, in fact, manufacturing output has risen and it's done nothing but grow. It's just that the relative percentage of the workforce employed in manufacturing has shrunk because of a combination of what Moody refers to as lean production and also of offshoring. But Moody is also very careful here to talk about the fact that, yes, a lot of manufacturing jobs have been kind of exported to the global south, but also this is happening everywhere, which is that things like lean production and so-called just-in-time logistics networks have really changed the dynamic of where the choke points of the capitalist production and distribution process are, which is why Moody is so keen on pointing out the increasingly important role of like logistics workers, transportation, warehouse, etc. It's because it's not because manufacturing is just irrelevant now. It's because the relative percentage of the workforce, not just in the United States, but also globally, that is in the short term and in the long term, because of increasing automation and so on, a smaller and smaller proportion of the working class globally is going to be involved directly in manufacturing production, and that's what I think a very important point that Moody stresses. So yeah, I don't know if you want to reflect on that before I hand things off to Izzy, or do you want to comment on that, Kyle?
Oh yeah, well, and just in general, that you both brought up, I think the important points that were missing from the summary. Melody, you reference both the increase in productivity as well as like that's correlation in terms of, and then Youseff references in terms of the correlation with employment, which is a really important detail. I think, and I just think that's it. Like that was a good gap filler, so to speak.
Okay, yeah. And then the other thing that is tangentially related to this, but you mentioned in your summary, Kyle, you mentioned neoliberalism. And one thing that I was really reflecting on, I think I was listening to Revolutionary Left Radio the other day. I think this is where I heard it. They were talking about how neoliberalism as an ideology kind of purports to be about reducing the role of the state. However, what we've really seen under neoliberal capitalism, especially now as it kind of transitions into this neo-fascist phase, is actually a dramatically expanded role of the state, particularly of militarized police, both domestically and abroad, and how imperialism has kind of been in crisis, especially for the last 20 years, with things like the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq going totally south. And the other thing is that this is where I really connected Moody's book here with another classic New School, I think, text called "Labor and Monopoly Capital" by Harry Braverman, which he wrote in 1974, and basically very prophetically remarked on the increasing role of police violence in the capitalist system. So and then just to wrap things up on my end here real quick, I saw this article, I can't remember where it's from, I'll have to look it up. I'll have to look it up and post it in the show notes or something. It was about how something really bananas, like 1 in every 4 Americans is employed doing so-called guard labor, which is highly correlated with inequality. So like the study that it referenced said the more people who are employed in so-called guard labor, the greater proportion that are employed that way, the more unequal the society is, like almost in every single case. So yeah, I think Izzy, your restroom break gave us a good expansion of our discussion here. So I think we're going pretty organically here with this discussion. I think it's working out well.
Yeah.
But why don't you go ahead and take us into chapter 8?
Okay, what I got out of chapter 8 is that it really just covers the really strange relation. I got a ton of like fidget toys and shit up on my desk because like I have like boundless energy. But yeah, it just covers this sets up a concept called the American scheme, at least as far as I read into the book, because I just really covered the chapters that we were going to be covering here, because like I stay busy, and calls it the American scheme, which is promising the American dream, but really only yielding results for the 1%, as it is phrased. And oh God, it is deathly silent. You'll have to excuse me. This has been like the first time I've done this in a very, very long time.
It's good. You're good. Remember, we're all comrades here. We're all studying and struggle together, and there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. So, you know,
Absolutely.
we're all here for each other.
Yes, but this chapter also states how third parties are like a perennial feature of U.S. elections, but never really get any traction because the current electoral system is designed to literally sidestep and work around them. Because I didn't know why. Oh my God. Yes, I am a hot mess. There's also parts in here where it says pragmatic left-leaning movements. They hitch their wagon to the Democratic Party just because it gets a marginal amount of change accomplished rather than the lofty goals set out initially. And these movements over time cause the Democratic Party to, as most people would put it, switch sides on a lot of things. Namely white supremacy and states' rights, and more over to welfare and things like that. But all the Democratic Party is intrinsically linked to certain blocks of the capital class to get anything done, because. Okay, and that's where my notes trail off because, oh shit, I am woefully underprepared.
It's
I
okay.
apologize.
You're fine, comrade.
You're hitting at, I think, the central point of the entire section, which is he's trying to take an opportunity to present electoral politics, both from without, so to speak, from within a broader context. Everything he's talking about is focused on the Democratic Party, just as you were saying. It's all filtered through it because that's the choice that we have in terms of the United States. First past the post, two major political parties. And in this chapter, in the next one, he goes more internally to examine the Democratic Party. But in this chapter, it's about sort of the broader structures through which the Democratic Party has both changed itself. Say the Dems' abandoning of labor in the 1980s and the embracing of Reaganomics. He talks about Jimmy Carter, I think, a little bit, which is really good because I don't like the rehab that goes on around Jimmy Carter, who's an asshole, when it came to screwing over organized labor, especially in the United States, and embracing neoliberal economics. But it most importantly is examining attempts, and he does this throughout the section, right? Attempts at engagement from outside groups, either more purely outside, like through Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign and the Rainbow Coalition, or more internal campaigns. And the example he uses, the perfect example that I'm sure we're all familiar with, Michael Harrington's Liberal Labor Coalition, and Harrington's, party within a party principle. So yeah, I think in general you touched on the basic ideas very effectively, and that I think the most important part is examining the scheme before moving more internally, which he does in the next chapter. Melody, Professor, I don't know if you have something to add to that.
No, that's perfect. And like I was saying, like, Izzy, don't feel bad at all. We're all here to like learn and fill in each other's gaps and like discuss, and this is all kind of dialectics in motion, right? Yeah. Like pedagogy, like learning is a collective process. Political education is a collective process, and it's not about being the having the best everything, all your ducks in a row, because we're all of different abilities and we have different strengths and different weaknesses. I ramble like you wouldn't believe. So, again, just stressing here, and like also for our audience, like really, being, having a compassionate and collective attitude towards education and struggle. This is really how we move forward. Oh, thank you. And so because our friend Simba, speaking of just that, because our friend Simba wasn't able to join us, I'm going to ask Kyle to go ahead and summarize chapter 9 for us. Go ahead.
Sure. Apologies, this is going to be a little haphazard. I've got lots of reflections and not as many notes. But I think the sort of what we were setting up there in terms of the way that this section works, I think is the perfect description for chapter 9. It's titled "The Democratic Party Cul-de-sac," and basically, as we were hearing before, this part of our on new terrain is essentially an attempt to engage with electoral politics, as we'll see in the next chapter, which is electoral politics from a socialist perspective. Chapter 8 was mostly related to this American scheme, which is about sort of the from without context that the Democratic Party finds themselves in. And chapter 9 is more the from within context. So he's discussing, let me pull up, I took some quick notes really quickly when we got on the call, and they're here somewhere, and there they are. He describes what I actually think is a really useful term that I'm sure has been used elsewhere, but I'm not the most read political student of political science outside of Marxian texts, but pressure tactics from within the context of the Democratic Party. He's trying to understand exactly, okay, when people do choose to engage with the Democratic Party, what's the ways in which they do it, and what were ultimately the results? And he nodded to it in chapter 8 with the Rainbow Coalition, who I think is a very useful example that he brings up frequently, and I think is in general a useful example that other people have brought up. I think of like Max Elbaum, as well as other people who are sort of contextualizing the new left, both in the United States as well as in the UK, to discuss that. But basically what he's doing is he's trying to give a little bit of credence in some places to the idea that there are portions from within the Democratic Party that are permeable in small ways. But the problem with those points of engagement is that they ultimately are very singular and very atomized. Meaning, for example, when organized labor wants to ultimately engage in electoral politics, they can do so through individual candidates, but they aren't able to often do so through, say, like a slate model, which he talks about more like slate models of electoralism in the next chapter, in chapter 10. And essentially, right here, he's trying to show that the fundamental makeup of the Democratic Party as a non-member organization party, which we are not. If you vote in a Democratic primary, you are not a member of the Democratic Party, as in a dues-paying member of that group. You ultimately don't have a say in the way that the Democratic Party is run. You are part of a party structure that is ultimately bureaucratic. It's two things. One, it's bureaucratic, and it's supposed to be that way. He talks about in the chapter I believe, if I remember correctly, the sort of shift from just a bourgeois party to a bureaucracy in the Democratic Party as being one of the major shifts in under neoliberalism that have occurred in American party politics. I think he's absolutely right about that. It's really funny that I ended up on chapter 9 because I've always been this left wing, but after college, I had experience in organizing and I needed a way to make money. So I went and I worked on political campaigns for the Democratic Party. So I have lots to say about everything that's in this chapter. And spoiler alert, I basically agree with all of it. Essentially, for example, in terms of pressure tactics, he described the relationship between organized labor and the Democratic Party as similar to the relationship during the collective bargaining process for labor, with one small exception. Ultimately, organized labor does not have anything to take away from the Dems. Organized labor, when they get pissed off at their bosses, they get down to contract and negotiation, and they say, well, this contract is bullshit, it's not good, we're going to go on strike, like GM's doing right now, like grocery workers in the Pacific Northwest are doing right now. We're in something of a strike wave currently, so this is a very, very relevant book and a very relevant section. Labor only has pulling of monetary contributions, their political donations, as a means for trying to place a check on the Democratic Party. So the idea that the Democratic Party's membership is able to act as a check on it doesn't really pan out in the way that a lot of people think it does. So it poses the question, who is the Democratic Party accountable to? And Moody, I think, very astutely and appropriately argues that their donor base is to whom they're ultimately accountable to. And while that there are points in which that you can engage in the Democratic Party that will allow for some small semblance of change, is that the fundamental makeup of the party itself requires doing a lot more than that. He also talks about direct primaries as a mode of political engagement in the electoral sphere, and how, while that's in some ways good, and why in a lot of ways that's it gives us an ability to engage in a way that we feel like is, effective and helpful and can infiltrate the party and change the party from the inside. But his argument that he makes, and I think is very sound, is that it's individualizing and atomizing, whether for the political candidate themselves or whether for the voter themselves. He didn't get into a ton of detail here because it's already a decently long book, and he kept it in a, spoiler alert for my assessment of it. This is a book that a lot of people can read, but I find myself writing details in the margins a lot about the particularities of political primaries and how they are ultimately atomizing. I think about geographic atomization, how modes of engagement in terms of primarying political candidates in the Democratic Party are going to be concentrated in areas that have people who are ultimately going to be able to vote in those parties. And essentially, you have to go up against incumbency in order to do so. And it makes me think a lot about the ways in which urban space, in particular, that's a lot of the base of the Democratic Party. A lot of it is people of color in the South, especially. But I think of urban spaces like New York, probably the most popular primary upset that's happened in recent memory with this is the first time in my life I've forgotten her name because she's everywhere. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah.
And that part of the problem.
Yeah, against Joe Crowley, no less.
Yeah, exactly. A giant party mucky muck. And while this was a very sort of an opportunity that's gotten people engaged in the political process, by virtue of the way that we live our lives, by virtue of the way that our cities are, I think about social redlining, basically, how throughout the 20th century, segregation was no longer segregation in terms of racialized minorities, as in an explicit segregation, but rather an implicit segregation through the way that our cities essentially have been laid out or whatever. Because that's how we draw voter districts. And then you can go into the weeds with that, but it makes me think a lot about the atomizing process through which this sort of political engagement is required to go through. And so ultimately it doesn't have the effects, the sort of lasting, big shifting effects that people want, because the fundamental makeup of the Democratic Party is bureaucratic, and it is accountable to both its donors as well as another section that he gets into that I thought was very valuable, all of the individual bureaucratic associations from within the Democratic Party. We oftentimes talk about the DNC, but the DNC is the federal arm. It's essentially like an umbrella, and underneath of it you have the DGA, the DSCC, the Democratic Governors Association, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, which is the Senate, the federal Senate arm of the DNC, and then the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the House of Representatives arm of the DNC, and then as well as the DLCC, which is the down-ballot, state-level Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, remembering my acronyms. And then there's also the state party infrastructure in the individual states themselves. And having a lot of experience having to deal with that shit, I can tell you that it is absolutely extraordinarily bureaucratic. It's very insulated. And what it does what Moody says it does, which it concentrates the potential amount of money that a political candidate can get in order to participate in their election, not just within the Democratic Party itself, which it absolutely does, but within the fundamental bureaucratic mechanisms of the Democratic Party too. Which is basically all to say that if you're one of the good old boys and you're in with the group, that's the means through which you can engage in electoral politics. And if that's the case, then how much are you changing the Democratic Party from the inside, so to speak, if the real way to make a more lasting and meaningful and impactful change by getting into office is coming alongside that apparatus? The atomizing portion and the singular portion of it is because there's not enough people doing this. And the way that he sees it, it's not enough of a risk to sort of go all in on this in order to in order to develop a mass working class party. And so that's actually just a portion of it either.
I was going to make a comment if you're.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Moody stresses, like in this chapter, but also throughout the book, is the increasing kind of barriers to entry of just political participation, period, specifically with regards to campaign funding. So in this, there's a kind of a little sub-article. It's on page 125 to 126 if you want to follow along, which is talking about how just absolutely ridiculously expensive it is to run these campaigns, regardless of your party. But it, and with the Citizens United versus Federal Elections Commission Supreme Court decision back in 2010, which allows unlimited anonymous campaign contributions, we've just seen the business sector has always had a stranglehold on American politics, but especially after Citizens United versus FEC, it's just the floodgates open like never before. And so I'm gonna quote Moody on page 126 here. He says, spending on digital political ads rose from $22 million in 2008 to $158 million in 2012 and is expected to hit $1 billion for the 2016 election and over $3 billion by the 2020 elections. So another thing that he's doing in stressing this radical, expansion of campaign finance is that the Democrats in particular are much less interested in doing the things that they did when they were slightly more attached to the American working class back in the kind of the pre-neoliberal era, kind of. So I'd say the period between the New Deal and kind of the late 1960s. What they used to do was they had what Moody periodically refers to as ground game. They had, people, union reps going door to door for candidates, and people canvassing, and there was just a lot more people with pounding the pavement, going out there and getting their message out about candidates, and so this switch over to this highly financialized campaigning strategy is, what Moody's really saying is that what they're doing with this is they're focusing on hyper targeted advertising of political campaigns. So, through Facebook and Twitter and all these things that, these companies collect just oodles of personal data from their users. There's he says, there's Aristotle, which is a political analytics company, says that they collect 500 data points, as many as 500 data points for every user that they get their information from. So so they're able to use that information to do very acute political campaign ad targeting. And then, but what Moody kind of says the result of that is that it's basically a self-fulfilling prophecy that targets people who are already likely to vote, which is disproportionately wealthy, upper middle class, suburban white people, which in not just in this book, but in Moody's other writings, basically says that the Democratic Party, to the extent that it's like still has a stable voter base, like what they've been doing is, and this was definitely evident in the 2018 elections, was that they were really focusing on flipping red wealthy suburban districts that they thought they could, win by running like a moderate or whatever. So that's another thing. And then I'll just before I get too rambly here, I'll just comment that like what Kyle just put forward about the structures of the Democratic Party, the bureaucracy, is like we have to remember these are all highly developed political institutions that are, they didn't just get conjured out of the ground. They've existed for generations. They've built up on, even though the Democratic Party doesn't represent, the slave owning class per se anymore, that's what their foundations were. They still have the Jefferson Jackson dinner every year. That's their big fundraiser, their $30,000 a plate fundraiser. And then you have to remember that, like, especially if you're maybe, a socialist who wants to go in and change the party from the inside, naively, I would say, you have to play by their rules. And what I mean by that is that, like, for example, I'd say like the most stark example of this is Bernie Sanders stumping for anti-choice conservative Democrats. And like the bankruptcy of that is just so apparent to me that like I'm kind of editorializing here a bit, but it's just what I think just really falls short of the kind of bread and roses caucus of the DSA, the kind of more wing of the DSA that's concentrated around Jacobin and that whole milieu. So we're kind of running long here, and I still have to summarize chapter 10. So like I'm just going to go around for each of us and kind of say, well, do you want to discuss anything further from chapter 9? Or
I just want to ask a question and pose it to all three of you, basically, regarding America's political system at this juncture with these corrupt two political parties. So, what's to be done? How should we proceed in uniting a working class and or an alternative political party? Should, as some say, should we use the Democratic Party and get a number of progressive socialists elected and change the political character and direction of that party to pursue change in America? Or should we, as Moody says, there is obviously, as Yukai explained very nicely, obstacles to a third party? How do we proceed with the third party if we or you oppose using the Democratic Party as a platform to change our political system?
Sure. I want to give Izzy a chance to comment. She hasn't commented in a while, and so if you'd like to say something, please go for it.
Well, let me sit and stew on this for a second, because that's a really good question.
That's fine.
I'm going to wrap my head around it.
That's fine. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and since that question can kind of sit on our back burner for a sec while I go ahead and summarize chapter 10. So let me just switch things over here, because I've got to pull up my script again. Let me figure this out.
It's a great script.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So the chapter 10 is called Electoral Politics from a Socialist Perspective. Mm-hmm. And in it, Moody outlines some successful strategies that left-wing and labor activists have taken in the electoral arena in the U.S. in recent years. and really lays out the importance of, as Youseff kind of just laid out, the importance of being as independent from the Democrats as humanly possible. Moody's pretty unequivocal in his political stance there.
Yeah.
But he also importantly he outlines some major failures and difficulties that has come into. So he really consistently stresses the importance of independent movements like Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter. And he argues that leftists who push for electoral campaigns kind of in that top-down way are really getting the equation of social change backwards. So while some on the US left are attempting to emulate the successes of the social democratic parties in Europe, especially in the so-called age of Euro-communism, which was the kind of the parties of the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Europe. They have been, Moody points out that they've been pulled significantly to the right over the last 20, 30 years, and really embraced neoliberalism. And I mean, even in some of these countries where big left-wing parties are in power, they've been the ones who enact the austerity measures that were so destructive to those economies. So Moody contrasts different strategies for approaching electoral politics. As a negative example, he cites the ill-fated Labor Party in the US, formed in 1996 by labor leaders who were sick of the Democratic Party's rightward drift and its increasing detachment from the unions. However, Moody posits that this project failed because it essentially tried to conjure a movement for an independent party out of thin air at the national level rather than building something from the ground up. Its leaders were ultimately too afraid to be spoilers of the election and risk taking, quote unquote, taking votes away from the Democrats. And that would ultimately spell doom for the Labor Party, as it effectively died after the 2000 election. So to contrast this, Moody cites a very successful example of the Richmond Progressive Alliance in the city of Richmond, California, which is kind of he uses the term refinery town. It's dominated by Chevron oil, and Chevron really dominated the political scene in the city government there. And he cites, there's a labor activist, goes by Steve Early, and he quotes him saying, the RPA is simultaneously an electoral formation, a membership organization, a coalition of community groups, and a key coordinator of grassroots education and citizen mobilization. That's the end of the quote. The RPA is hence much closer to a traditional membership labor party, an organization capable of collecting dues and coordinating action. And while not explicitly socialist, militant organization, it nevertheless provides a much more ideal model for a future socialist party than the short-lived Labor Party we just mentioned. Later in the chapter, Moody points out that city governments are a vulnerability of the Democrats that the left could potentially exploit, because so many cities are overwhelmingly blue, where Republicans haven't held office in years and probably won't, and there's very little risk of the so-called spoiler effect. It's a good opportunity for leftists to field candidates, and he cites the example of Shama Sawant in Seattle, who ran for the city council in Seattle back in, I think, 2013, and with her biggest, supporter base came from the working class in Seattle. And if you ever go on Facebook or on Twitter or anything and you look up Shama Sawant, it's just a flood of bourgeois right-wing propaganda saying what a horrible, horrible person she is, and she's going to bankrupt Seattle, and and there's plenty of racism in there too, because she's of Indian descent. I believe. Don't quote me on that. So he basically says that this could be doing this kind of thing on a more systemic basis could be sort of the proving grounds for a kind of grassroots approach that that the RPA did. And although we could, and I say we in a very loose sense here, we could infuse those movements with a much more radical character that's able to hold these elected officials to account to our movement. But I think, again, this is where Moody really stresses, you have to have the movement there first. You can't just, wish your way into power with a progressive candidate. So the next thing I want to talk about is, I kind of mentioned this earlier, is that he talks about this in chapter 9, is that Democrats are increasingly reliant on so-called purchased forms of getting votes, less door knocking and canvassing and more targeted advertising to appeal to an increasingly upper middle class and wealthy voter base, who are disproportionately more likely to vote. And this is kind of an important thing that I want to interject here, is that while Moody is somewhat sympathetic to a very limited engagement with left-wing electoral politics, he's really emphatic that this is the lowest form of politics. This, and that real social struggle has to be much more like the Richmond Progressive Alliance, has to be much more rooted in the workplace, rooted in neighborhoods, and so on. So I have this really important quote. It's on page 168 if you want to follow along. He says, "What such electoral action cannot do is be the vehicle for a transition to socialism per se, even if it helps pave the road. Quote-unquote parliamentary socialism, the idea that a socialist society can be crafted either gradually or rapidly through the machinations of legislators operating in a conventional parliamentary context, is an old but failed idea. It is ultimately an elitist idea that socialism is something that can be negotiated and legislated from above via nationalization to be implemented by the existing bureaucratic state. As Hal Draper put it succinctly in his classic book, The Two Souls of Socialism," actually I think it's an essay, "The Two Souls of Socialism," it's a good essay, you should go read it. Quote, "The greatest problem of our age is the achievement of democratic control from below over the vast powers of modern authority," end quote. Moody writes, "The modern bourgeois state, no matter how formally democratic, exists to protect private property and control conflict, not to nurture it, whether by means of soft, New Deal, or hard, fascist, or the in-between model of neoliberalism. Its elected branches are only one aspect of this essentially bureaucratic formation. State socialism," Draper also argues, stemming from the theories of Ferdinand Lassalle and later Edward Bernstein, among many others, right up to our own time, is the exact opposite of what Marx argued for, end quote. And yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about earlier with the kind of the right wing of the DSA, kind of congregating around this idea that we can, all hail Saint Bernie, and we'll have usher in communism tomorrow morning for breakfast. So I'm gonna wrap up my summary. It's just a couple more paragraphs here. So here Moody echoes Lenin's reading of Marx, made famous in the State and Revolution. The working class cannot grab the levers of bourgeois rule and use it for its own ends. The institutions of bourgeois democracy were created for the repression of the working class and must be dismantled, not simply seized. So what does Moody propose instead? He concludes this chapter by stating, quote, "One more speculation on the relationship of a socialist future to the seemingly prosaic tasks of workplace organization. Strong, democratic workplace stewards organization has a prefigurative dimension. If direct democracy in production is a feature of the self-emancipation of the working class, then the existing organization that involves different aspects of direct democracy has a role to play in the development of socialism from below. And, indeed, this was the case in at least one of the rare revolutionary upsurges in the 20th century. In the working class upsurge that followed World War I, workers in many industrialized countries or regions developed a new type of organization. The structures of the trade unions of the day, whether craft or industrial, existed outside of and removed from the workplace for the most part, with negotiations conducted by and strikes called off by full-time officials. In country after country, in slightly different ways, industrial workers began to organize on the job through systems of directly elected delegates. In Britain, this became the shop stewards movement. In Germany, the Berlin-based revolutionary stewards or delegates, and in Italy, the factory councils. In the United States, workplace-based delegate systems also emerged in these years in a number of different industries. These were generally understood by revolutionary socialists and syndicalists to be embryonic organs of political power based in the heart of production, similar to the early Soviets, workers' councils in Russia. As the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci put it, in the most advanced form, the factory council is the model of the proletarian state. So that wraps up chapter 10. So I think maybe the best thing to do now is to go do just a round table of our kind of initial thoughts, I guess. That'd be a good thing to do. We can do that either individually for each chapter, or we can kind of do a global discussion. What do you think is best, comrades?
Go ahead, Izzy.
I think a global discussion would be probably better, because I've noticed that I've been freezing up a lot.
I
feel like a deer in headlights.
Okay, that's all right. That's all right.
But, if I could just jump in really quick.
Yeah, go for it.
10, because I think you brought up some good points, and summarized it very effectively. And a lot of stuff, some things that stuck out to me in this chapter, and part of this can come from a larger assessment, but specifically about the chapter itself is, and actually even in chapter 9 too, it's stuff that Moody is nodding to, but I don't think he wanted this to be like a 1,500 page 3-volume book, so he maybe didn't choose to focus on within these contexts, but is sort of the discursive, the way that we talk about working class ability within the context of the Democratic Party. Two things. First is that the internal dialogue that has, in terms of culture, in terms of the way that we communicate about the social world, has stifled the dissenting voice, like not just effectively, but in an almost totalizing way, and essentially elevated the adult conversation, supposedly, of liberalism to the height of its potential as ultimately an inevitability. Liberalism, the highest stage of capitalism, I guess. Neoliberalism, to make a Lenin joke. The idea that our conversations around one's capability, around the capability of the working class, have been stifled both from within and without the Democratic Party, I think really holds weight, and is reflected in the way that the Democratic Party abandons their actual base, which is really, it's people of color, who are like a proportionate representatives of the working class, essentially racial minorities, in favor of the bureaucracy space, which is their donors. And what that leads to, and I think is the really important takeaway from Moody's book, especially this section and especially this chapter, is that there is no incentivized coherency within the context of the Democratic Party. The problem with the Dems is that there is no benefit to actually obtaining a level of working class solidarity, because based off of the principles of the party, the bureaucratic neoliberal party, there is always going to be space, not just space given to supposed outliers. If the Dems are at the left, which we know they're not, but within the context of American politics, they are. We live in a very uniquely libertarian country. not only are your Joe Manchins as well as Obama, for example, the best example of someone who used sort of his rhetorical ability to elevate a neoliberal economic ideology rather than something that's populist, something that's more social, even more kind of socialist, even more social democratic.
Yeah.
Those individuals are always going to be not just given space, but more space within the context of that party, even more so than left liberals, rad libs, or whatever, democratic socialists, that ultimately the only coherency that can respond to this is working class solidarity.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what the
We're
Democratic
muted
Party
right now.
does,
Sorry.
in order to be
We're
able to
muted
keep
right now.
the bourgeois
So they can't
elements
hear
of
us.
its party, is appeal to the sort of good nature aspect of philosophical liberalism, liberty, equality, fraternity, that kind of a thing, which in principle I think are just in general good humanist principles. But the problem is that that ideology is completely wrapped up within the context of economic capitalism, that they're officially, I would say, it's going out on a limb, but inextricable from one another in that particular context. So I think what we can see is that like material analysis is what encompasses a more coherent struggle, which is not present within the Democratic Party. Not that those sort of good natures ideas, which are coming from the right place, that people should be equal, and you shouldn't be discriminated based off of genders, sexual orientation, any level of divergence really from the mean or the norm. Those are good ideas, but unless those are incorporated within a more coherent struggle, a set of demands, and a potential payoff, which is the way that it becomes Marxist, that's the only thing in a contemporary context that's going to offer the level of coherency necessary to actually achieve the goals of all of these, radical liberals or democratic socialists or social democrats or whatever we want to call them within the context of that party. I think it makes a lot of sense when you're examining the cost benefit of engaging within that space, which is the most. My chapter 9 summary was not great. I had to throw it together at the last minute, but I think we managed to pull some really good gems out there. But one thing I forgot was this sort of cognitive dissonance in terms of what it costs to engage in that space versus what the actual benefits are, which is why radical ideology, like the goal of the abolition of class or the goal of the abolition of wage labor, is so significant within these contexts, is because it's the only thing that is going to actually allow for the level of coherency that we need to build a working class movement. And the problem with it is that it's not going to happen within the context of the Democratic Party because, as we saw earlier, the structure, the very imposing structure, the fundamental, as you perfectly, I think, alluded to, the fundamental structure that's a historical structure of the Democratic Party is developed in such a way where it is always going to, in the same way that capital does, reinforce its existing mechanisms, and which is at the same time always suppressing another mechanism, right? It reminds me of the way that Marx's expansion on Hegel, right? The conflicts between the classes is what's pushing history forward, and you're sort of begetting more conflict. With the success of the capitalist class always comes with the repression of the working class. And that was a really long, rambly way to say that I just in general think he's right.
Yeah.
That the coherency just isn't there.
Yeah.
And that's the main problem.
So thank you, Kyle. Youseff wants to respond. Izzy, are you doing all right over there?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty okay. I had to throw on 16 more layers of irony just to cope, though, as you can.
It's okay.
Pro irony.
Yeah. No, we're very pro joking and fun. Just don't be mean. Go ahead, Youseff.
Yeah, well, Kyle, you actually answered my question, maybe implicitly, and obviously, as we heard Melody read portions of Moody's chapter, he explicitly explains that it's not going to work if we use the Democratic Party as a platform to inject progressives, leftist, Marxist, socialist into that party. It's not going to work because at the greater scale, we also have Republican Party, and we have this powerful corporate elite, and that's not going to happen. That's not going to be the way to go forward in bringing about the change that we need. So obviously that raises the next question. So what's to be done? The question that comes to my mind. So that is, if we cannot use the Democratic Party as a platform to make changes that are needed in our country, then how do we proceed with an independent, progressive, socialist party that is very, at this juncture, especially with the working class, with no experience of being organized for such a long, long time since the deindustrialization of America, basically in early 1970s, with unions just nowhere to be found, scattered strikes here and there are, of course, signs of optimism. But I think we talked earlier before the show here that with the uh, ever-changing composition of the labor force or labor workers, working class in America, ethnically, gender-wise, religiously, I have to add, all the different values, and also racially. Um, what if? What if economics is not the number one issue on this very diverse labor force mind, but they want, say, cultural, social, religious issues to be addressed first. This is a very, very serious challenge to move forward.
And so, I have some kind of immediate comments there, and exactly what I wanted to bring up in our pre-stream discussion here. Youseff and I were hanging out a little beforehand, loosening up. What I was trying to recollect but couldn't bring up was Lenin's writing on the right of nations to self-determination within, because so when the Bolsheviks were organizing in the Russian Empire was not, it was a giant collection of Muslims, Jews, Slavs of different ethnicities, of many different religions. They're trying to organize many different factions and ethno-religious categories that a lot of them were very distrustful and kind of hated each other. The Jewish Bund, that's kind of my attachment to this history.
Absolutely.
They were very distrustful of all of the socialist parties, despite themselves, having very socialistic impulses, and in some cases, like in the case of like Leon Trotsky, for example, being directly involved in the socialist movement. So I think that, and this might sound a little bit tangential, but I think I maybe disagree with Moody a little bit here in how, in the kind of the first part of the book, he talks about the so-called the changing composition of the American working class. But what I really think that this is it's not so much a change in the actual composition of the working class, but a change in the way that political economists and sociologists and political thinkers in general are really conceptualizing the working class. Because the working class, like Moody basically, to summarize his argument, says that the working class has changed in that it's become more multi-ethnic, more less white, less based around extraction and manufacturing industries, and much more centered around hospitality and logistics and so on, fast food, hotel workers, nurses, and so on and so on. So, but what I think this really obfuscates, at least if I'm understanding his framing correctly, what I think this really obfuscates is what I just said about how sociologists and political theorists and so on are actually conceptualizing the working class, because it is the working class, both in the United States and globally, has always been multi-ethnic, has always been multi-gendered, has always been, this is exactly what, like I think, and Youseff and I talked a bit about this earlier, is that like the conditions of people who exist in kind of the extra legal realm, like sex workers, are like disproportionately come from marginalized backgrounds and are disproportionately exposed to the violence of the capitalist system, especially the police state. And so yeah, it's just a lot to cover here. But and like maybe this is my critique of Moody, is that I think he's talking about this in terms of, okay, here's how the working class has actually changed. I think this is a conceptual shift. I think this is a shift in how, you know, political economists and theorists and sociologists and et cetera are thinking about how the working class is composed rather than actual changes in its composition. I'm not saying that that isn't also true, but I would argue I think it's a shift in conceptualization rather than actual, like I would put more weight on that side. Izzy, do you want to jump on there?
Dead air.
That's okay. I kind of dumped a lot out there, and
Yeah.
we'll keep it loose. If you something comes to mind, just you know, start talking. Let us know. And I'll Youseff and Kyle, I'll let you respond to me. Or I think I like where this is going. We summarized the book, and now we're kind of expanding on its themes in a very free-form style. I really like this style of discussion.
Well, you know, the multi-ethnicity of Europeans in the 19th century was way different from what it is today here in America. So, where were the blacks, say, in Europe? Okay, there were obviously the Poles, the Irish, among others,
different kind of marginalized
who moved to UK to work, and they did get united. But remember, they were all white workers, and Protestant Catholics mainly.
Major antagonism.
Exactly. So they did have their problems, as you just pointed out, their frictions. Nevertheless, they managed. But I am not as optimistic as Moody is.
Moody's very optimistic.
Very optimistic about our progressives' ability to be able to organize a very large, effective, united working class in opposition to this very strong and entrenched capitalist system that has a lot of teeth. And they can drag this situation for a very, very long time. Which, obviously, if we take the dialectic approach here, at the same time as they do, as they push back the workers will push more. So that's the idea. So when Donald Trump got elected, my first reaction was to many of my colleagues that I quoted Lenin, that sometimes some nations in their history have no choice but to take a step backward so that they can take a leap forward. So I am, in that respect, very optimistic that these current conditions, and if Donald Trump gets reelected, will continue to worsen, and that will reignite, taking again the Hegelian approach, that will encourage the working class to get organized as the conditions, in fact, in this case, as we know, the Donald Trump, not economically, but religiously, racially, ethnically, everybody gets hurt.
Right.
And that is the only hope that I have. And unfortunately, that is, things have to get worse before they get better.
Yeah, and so I have kind of an immediate response to kind of all of this, which is that I think it's important to kind of again, to quote Lenin, is to say there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen.
Yeah.
And what I really want to stress when by just not just pulling that quote out of thin air here is that Moody's book was written and developed and finally published from 2016 to 2017. So he did have the election of Donald Trump in his
Yes, he
in his
did.
consciousness, but so much has happened in working class self activity over the last 2 or 3 years. We had the absolutely explosive, spontaneous anti-Trump protests on Inauguration Day that had the whole every major city in the U.S. was having riots, and then there's also been like the anti-ICE resistance movement, like Occupy ICE, which started in our town right here in Portland.
Absolutely.
Where hundreds of people came and like physically blocked off ICE facilities all over the country. And then, on top of all of those things going on, there's also, all kinds of direct aid societies doing things for migrants who are being terrorized by ICE, sheltering people, that kind of thing. And then there's also the fact that union struggle is, and not just, union with a capital U, but like union struggle and labor struggle has kind of come back into the forefront. There was this huge moment with, and I think another thing, just to kind of put another tangent in there, is that the Me Too movement was absolutely like sent shockwaves through this whole society.
Yeah.
Because so suddenly there's so much sexual assault and all these other horrible aspects of gender violence came into sharp relief, both like just in general, but especially in the workplace, where for example I'm struggling to pinpoint a location here, but I just read this absolutely harrowing story about Black women who worked for McDonald's, walking out and striking, both for better wages, but also to protest sexual assault from bosses and from customers. And so like that adds another kind of ingredient into this storm of struggle that's going on. And then I would say the most kind of just very focal thing that happened over the last couple of years has been the teachers' struggles, starting especially in West Virginia.
Yeah.
Last spring. There's a fantastic book, by the way, by Eric Blanc about it's called Red State Revolt, which is all about that whole strike wave that started in West Virginia. And I really dislike Blanc's politics. He's part of that kind of right wing of DSA that I really can't express enough distaste for. But he's a very fine labor journalist, and this writing is really top notch, and I'd highly recommend people get their hands on it. It's very accessible. Anyway, so there's been this massive resurgence of labor struggle in with the teacher strikes, and then also with hotel workers, with nurses, and fast food workers. And again, here in Portland, we have the first federally recognized fast food union. Quick shout out to the Burgerville Workers Union, who are currently struggling to get a better wage.
Yeah.
We are with you all the way. If you can follow them
Yes.
on, if you're listening, and you can follow them on Twitter. I will look up their handle just a sec. But also another local burger chain called Little Big Burger is trying to unionize, and both are under the auspices of the IWW. So this is not just like petty, amateurish unionizing. This is serious militant union activity going on.
Yeah.
And I really my hope is that they'll provide a model for what other fast food and hospitality workers can do across the country. So Yeah, so I'll just wrap up by saying, like, I want to maybe challenge your pessimism, Youseff.
Yeah.
Is that things are not. I'm not a starry-eyed optimist about this myself,
Yeah.
but there are a lot of seeds of revolt.
Sure.
And they need to be nourished, and they need to be forged
Correct.
into a coherent force.
Before Kyle says anything, I just want to add one point as my last point. That is, why can we actually have a two-pronged policy or approach to this problem? That is, while we use the Democratic Party as a platform to inject progressives, leftists, socialists into that party, to change that party from the within. In the meantime, as things keep getting worse, we can have the opportunity to organize workers, form more unions, and hope for a revolution.
Oh, absolutely. So you hit my personal electoral philosophy of engagement, because I've thought about it a lot. You hit it on the head right there. I talk a lot on. I never plugged myself on YouTube. It's laborkyle. And I also stream a lot on Twitch and a conversation, which is also laborkyle, and Twitter, so you can follow me on everything. A lot of what I discuss when it comes to electoral politics is the idea of a triage team. Essentially, capital has created a level of bleeding that Marxists we could have seen coming, but I think a lot of people didn't. And so having a triage team to engage in certain spaces, sometimes within the context of the Democratic Party, sometimes not, I think is actually a really useful model for a few reasons. One, because it allows us to, as Moody alludes to, engage in different levels of electoralism up and down the ballot, and gives us opportunities to, around, say, like, workers' coalitions from in cities. I thought of another one, actually. The St. Louis Workers Education Society. Their president ran, I think, for like state, either the city council in St. Louis or the state legislature. I can't remember which. He lost, but not by much. And he did so under the auspices of this Workers Education Society that he's the president of, and it's essentially like a community center slash like active working group of a coalition of working people. And they were actually very, very effective in a city that has a ton of machine politics. And basically, they just made a bunch of lit that's just like commie, dirty, dirty commie. And it didn't work all that well. Not as well as they thought it was going to. It was closer than they thought. So that, I think, also is alluding to, as Moody was talking about in the book, that Southern California group. So I think a triage team is actually a decent idea in the meantime. However, the important part being that we're not going to be able to gain the level of engagement that we need in order to actually build a working class movement. And to back up a little bit to what y'all were talking about, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. I think you had mentioned earlier, Melody, you're emphasizing it. The ways in which we're defining work as sort of framing our conceptualization of the working class is just, it's an historic problem, as I'm sure as we all know. It's an historic issue. People have constantly been trying to reframe the idea of what labor and work are, and I think it's a continuation of that process, right? Because I think you're absolutely right. The level of exploitation has sort of dictated what is the broader working class. Well, it's not even the way that a lot of Marxists were defining it for a while. It was actually even broader than that. So I think that's a really good point. And then in terms of the optimism, pessimism, I sort of fall on the same side as both of you in a way, because I'm
dialectical
also not
synthesis.
Precisely. Yeah, I'm just trying to do some dialectics here. I'm not optimistic because our political imagination is dictated by a mode of engagement that is like bound within these contexts that we've been talking about, which is essentially engaging with the Democratic Party, making the party within the party, as Michael Harrington and members of the DSA have talked about for a really long time now. And our political imagination within those contexts is by default limited. And it's part of what I think and I'll get to it when we wrap up the book or whatever, but it's part of what's missing from the book. I don't think by fault of Moody, but because he didn't want to sit around and talk about discourse for 500 pages or whatever. But part of the problem is that within these contexts, we don't have an ability to imagine a greater form of political engagement. And I think it's because based off of these constant changes that we're dealing with in the way that capital organizes itself, as well as the ways workers organize themselves, and the composition of the working class, and mass migration, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is that we ultimately just need something new. But it doesn't have to be, it's not completely new, but it's, I think, what we've all been alluding to, which is the sort of, Professor, you said a two-pronged approach. I think that's great. I think it'd even be further than that, essentially just a multivariant approach in terms of engagement with politics. And the best way to do that is to build an independent coalition of all these different groups organized under the guise of our shared exploitation under capitalism. Taking two things into account. One, the way that all workers are exploited under capitalism, and two, the way that all workers are exploited in different and unique and increasingly horrifying and dehumanizing ways under capitalism, which allows for the space for culture to breathe, if you will, as well as is working within a context that people are familiar with, cultural exchange as an ultimate good. Religious difference, it's not exactly a live and let live policy, but it is the idea that pluralism is our path forward, especially considering the way that we're conceptualizing what the working class is, who's inside of it, and the way that we are trying to engage with something. And then the last thing, apologies for going on, is that the optimistic side of the argument that Melody was pushing forward, I think, is also really valid. And she mentioned some really, really good points, especially about Occupy ICE. I think about, you had mentioned Jewish identity as a means for political engagement earlier. I think about If Not Now, which has been really motivating, and there's a tremendous amount of leftists and socialists who are organizing within the context of If Not Now. And it's really, really inspiring and motivating to see that. The teacher strike, absolutely. I also think about the Stop and Shop strikes.
Oh, hell yeah.
The CWA strikes in the South.
And the UAW just went on strike?
Yes, absolutely. And what's so interesting about these strikes is that not only within the context that they're occurring in terms of industry, so both traditional production or whatever in terms of industrial production, like, assembly lines, that kind of a thing, working in an auto plant, versus working in a grocery store versus working as a teacher. All of these sort of lines, these sort of traditional demarcations between certain types of work are being blurred in a way that's really, really meaningful, because it's showing that not only is the idea of the working class expanding and shifting and changing, but our understanding of those shifts and those changes are becoming more sophisticated as time goes on. So while our mode of engagement makes me pessimistic because we don't share a political consciousness that gives space to whatever the fuck it is we actually need to get done in order to make this shit happen, but I also see a level of optimism in the way that the discourse has changed very radically in a lot of different spaces. It's resulted in a lot of liberals moving left, which I think is sometimes our ability as socialists or as Marxists to engage with left liberals and pull them into more egalitarian ideology is underrated. But that's only because I've had to hang out with libs a lot. And as you got to share the politics, right? And I've been able to pull some people left at doing that. And also, people who are not traditionally politically engaged, the one thing that they are very firmly understand, regardless of reactionary ideology or of a progressive ideology, is that they understand that they're being screwed over. And that is the first step, because if we're thinking about this, honestly, in a Marxian way, we talk about alienation, right? The traditional bounds of alienation in the late 20th and in the early 21st century, I see cracks forming in them. And I don't know how. I appreciate that Moody took a very cautious optimism, constantly qualifying this what could happen. I don't know if it's going to happen, which is the nuanced and appropriate take here, not getting too big for your britches, so to speak. But he's really like it puts us in a position to where like exploration is going to be spaghetti politics, if you will, is going to be sort of our mode of engagement for a while. Throw something, see if it sticks. And I also appreciate that y'all in the Pacific Northwest, because you brought up the new wobbly shops that have been popping up. And I am absolutely a red card carrying IWW member, and I predominantly organize with the IWW right now. In a very like it's a very broad, non-sectarian group. It's really exciting. That's what I like most. There's anarchists and communists and like all different types of people. It's also very queer too.
Oh,
so
that's
our
awesome.
gender representation is varied in a way that people I don't think get. Because there's me, who's at the core, the sort of core of the leadership as a queer person, and then we have non-binary people, we have women, like cisgendered women. It's a really remarkable shift. But the problem is that the optimism is always limited because it's just a discursive shift rather than a political shift. So we have to project and say, okay, there seems to be a strike wave going on. That's really, really great. So that could be good news. But we know it probably won't last. There's an ebb and flow to these things. But yeah, that's it. That's enough.
Sure. So Kyle, you mentioned there's the anarchist perspective too, and Izzy, I don't want to put you on the spot if you're not comfortable with it, but I know you self-identify as an anarcho-communist, so I was wondering, could we get your perspective on this?
Okay, one, Kyle, you're interesting as all heck. Like, I've just been sitting here, like, forgetting that I'm part of the stream, just, like, watching you. Like, holy shit. Like, peak content.
Thank you.
We're all making it happen, comrades. Collective struggle.
Hell yeah.
Right? Holy shit, hold on. There's a fucking mosquito in here.
Nice! Well done.
Okay. Now it smells like burnt hooker, so we're good. It's like my mood. It's usually me. I totally forgot what the fuck I was gonna say. I'm sorry.
It's okay. These are just free-form discussion. Totally.
Okay, now what was the topic? Because
So,
I got lost.
So we were talking about all this upsurge in kind of labor struggle and increased, unionization and so on, and we're also talking about kind of the electoral dimension, which I mean, I don't presume to know your politics, but I'm generally pretty anti-electoral, and I tend to find a sympathetic audience there with anarchists. A lot of anarchists follow me on Twitter because I'm so vehemently anti-electoral, despite the fact that I'm a Leninist, and I really I do believe in party building, but it's a party in the sense of kind of in the old sense of the word, like an organization, kind of like Moody talks about with the Richmond Progressive Alliance, except much more rooted in direct struggle rather than winning office. And that's a lot of the kind of the common ground I have with anarchist thought. And I was, again, you don't feel obligated, but I was just trying to, fit that into the discussion. If you have your own perspective there that you'd like to contribute, I'd absolutely welcome you to share that.
I do. And I am of the mind that, yes, electoral politics are mostly fucking useless. But you can, you may be able to take it from a two-pronged approach if you're able to, best analogy I have is, it's a terrible analogy, I think, maybe, when you go into the grand scheme of things, but it's the way Chancellor Palpatine became Emperor Palpatine is by infiltrating the Senate and working his way up. And he was advancing Darth Plagueis' agenda while also advancing his own, but there's a two-pronged approach there because Plagueis represents more of the non-electoral, direct action approach, and Palpatine is more of the going through the rungs of the government and reaching that point in which, by manipulating the state to his own, what's the word I'm looking for? Manipulating the state to his own will through subterfuge. And I think if one approaches it like that, electoral politics have somewhat of a utilitarian purpose, but for the most part, they're just so inundated with like capitalist influence that it's pretty much fucking pointless to try that. Also, you were talking about organization, and one of the things that I've noticed lately is that there's this upsurge in a lot of leftists who are all too willing to just completely shit on religious leftists, and that and religious people in general, and that disincentivizes a lot of people from actually joining into labor movements like this, because it what's, hold on, where are you? It exudes a antagonistic vibe.
It says you're not welcome here.
Off by that immediately. Yeah.
Yeah.
People are religious. Like,
and I mean,
I'm not religious, but if you're refusing to engage in that space, then
yeah,
you're ceding that space.
And I mean, I wouldn't call myself like a very like religious with a capital R, so to speak, person, but I was raised Jewish. I'm a practicing Jew, and I got into some really silly Twitter spats with you know, self-proclaimed Marxists and anarchists recently, where I was, you know, having to basically say, hey, you know, just this very basic thing, like, don't be an asshole to people of faith. Like, you know, like I like on one level, like I totally understand the impulse of like, because in like, especially in the United States, there's certain brands of Christianity that are like definitely like deeply imbricated with reactionary politics and like the influence of mega churches and that kind of thing, and like, you know, radio hate preachers and that kind of thing. And don't get me wrong, like I'm totally against that shit. That's bad. But like, you know, we also have to look at the flip side, which is that a lot of the socialist tradition in the United States comes from like Christian socialist, you know, liberation, you know, that kind of, that whole
Michael Harrington.
Yeah, no kidding. Harrington, well, I have my distaste for Harrington, but yeah, but you know, there's also, you know, there's Pan-Africanism, and there's this connections, you know, that's a form of socialism that's somewhat connected to religious leftism, as I understand it. I'm not terribly well informed on that, so I don't want to overstep on that.
Yeah.
But also, Youseff, maybe you could touch on this. In the Middle East, there's quite a bit of you know, there's maybe some intermingling of you know, religious tendency with socialist politics. Do you want to go off about that?
Just a few minutes. In fact, one organization in Iran back in 1970s that was called the People's Mujahideen in 1970s, and its group major goal was to resort to any form of terrorist act to destabilize Shah's regime, the monarchist, and destabilize the regime and use that instability, just like the basically the method of anarchists
or the Narodniks in Russia, yeah.
Destabilize and let the regime overreact, and then people get behind you and they fight back.
Mm-hmm.
So this group was deeply religious. They were Muslims,
mm-hmm.
and they called themselves Muslim Marxists.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not unique at all. There has always been ties between groups of religiously bound people
mm-hmm.
with Marxist and progressive ideas. So that's nothing unusual. You can keep those both. But what is, as you just mentioned, what is important is to oppose organized religion that sides with the ruling elites in opposing or basically suffocating or silencing the organized labor.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with all of this, and I feel I'm lucky to have been gifted the Southern evangelical perspective with regard to religious belief, which gives you an appropriate framing for really the two major parts of it. One, resisting ideologies of repression, which those of us who are queer, and if you grew up in a repressive religious environment, it makes you particularly guarded to those ideologies. So it's understandable the level of hostility some people possess, because I also have been through those sort of phases of hostility. But then on the other side of things, supporting ideologies of liberation. I think about the pedagogy of the oppressed. I think in general about liberation theology in Latin America, which is actually how I got on the left. So I have a decent amount of sympathy for sort of the Catholic workers, the rad cats, if you will, within the context of left-wing movements, as well as through Latin American liberation theology, because it demonstrates that the ways in which religion is not a monolith, as much as we would like it to be, because it makes it easier for us to be pissed off at it, because I like being pissed off at religious belief, and it's not hard to do in the United States in general, a very religious country. But when we allow that to grow into how we frame all people who possess religious belief, it starts to essentially pull a veil over the reality that we need to deal with, which is that a lot of people are religious, and a lot of people are religious in such a way that while their relationship with governing structures could ultimately cause them to be complicit in institutions of oppression, that I know enough religious people who are on the left to say that that is not a totalizing ideology. It's not a totalizing sphere. And that at the end of the day, it's about our ability to engage with individual people to build class consciousness that can allow those ideologies to shape themselves under the guise of liberation, say under the guise of the Synoptic Gospels rather than under the guise of Paul of Tarsus. Most of my research up until now has been in antiquity. Now I like to study depictions of antiquity, but early Christianity was really my specialty in my undergraduate thesis as well as in my master's thesis. Is about the Apostle Paul, and it gives you a really strong understanding of the ways in which religious belief is ultimately like it is not as monolithic as would be easy for those who are not interested in engaging in that space. So if we're interested in organizing the working class, you need to be able to have conversations and communicate with people who are religious rather than to be hostile, because I just don't see are we going to get everyone to stop being religious first and then organize the working class, or are we going to do it the other way around? Because I don't see the former being more easier than the latter. The latter just makes more sense to me. But I mean, I don't know anything about anything. But at the same time, like that just makes sense to me. I don't know.
Sure.
Honestly, I think in that scope of things, it's better to, if you're going to approach religious people for this sort of thing, I think it's better to avoid attacking the individual practitioner and rather critiquing the superstructures which allow for the kind of totalitarian leanings that a lot of evangelicals have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the other thing that I was going to say is that, like, I think there's that line from Marx about religion being the opiate of the masses that I think gets kind of misinterpreted a lot. Which is, the full quote is, it is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of a soulless condition. Which is to say, Marx says that, and I agree with him, but I'm critic. I'm still, well, I agree. I agree with some parts of it, but I have, I'm also practicing religious person myself, so I have my criticism, which he's saying that people fill in the void of capitalist alienation with religious practice. But like, I think that in a lot of capitalist and pre-capitalist, well, I don't, to the extent that there is such a thing anymore, but in a lot of capitalist contexts, your church or your mosque or your synagogue or whatever other temple community, religious or spiritual space that you have in your life that is where a lot of people develop some form of collective consciousness. The sense that, I'm not just an atomized individual floating alone in the sea of capitalist hell, right? They develop, as even if it's not like an explicit sense of anti-capitalism, obviously, because there's plenty of, pro-capitalist religious people, but like, it's this sense of I am more than just this consuming, producing neoliberal subject. I'm also, a creature of God, or whatever you want to, however you want to put it in whatever religious language that you have. It's to say that, and not just, I have a touch of the divine or whatever, but like, because that's kind of reductive, but like, the sense that I also belong to this community. These are people who I care about for reasons other than, transactional value, right? Maybe you pay dues to your church or whatever, but like, most people I think who develop, social life and social connections through their religious community are not doing so for purely transactional reasons. I can only speak for myself in that regard. That's what I get out of going to synagogue is so. But I think in that, like, it's really worth for leftists especially to be in touch with that and to be in touch with the fact that the seeds of collective consciousness are there in a lot of religions, not all religions, but that seed of I'm not just a lonely, worker, consumer, etc. In this atomized sea of capitalist hell. There's aspects of that are you can really push forward in organizing spaces, and I feel like to be so critical of religion kind of at first contact especially is to be kind of like you're just immediately going to lose your audience, and it comes off, even if you're being very like sincere about it, I think it comes off as kind of arrogant and like immediately this person who you're agitating with or whatever is immediately like, oh, this person doesn't see me as like fully capable of like thinking or whatever, or they see me as like a dupe of religion.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of what I wanted to say about that.
Yes.
Yeah. That is a lot of what I've been seeing from some people on the left. It's they've come off immediately antagonistically, and like as a Satanist myself, like religious pluralism is like my whole deal. So, but Kyle, check your audio. Like you were trying to say something back then, I couldn't hear you.
I was talking to my dog,
Oh,
and
okay.
I was muted.
I was worried for a sec.
No, I was telling him he's a good boy, and that's it.
Okay.
Youssef's dog is sitting outside on the patio, just kind of lonely and await.
She's a riot. That's why she's outside.
Yeah, she's a riot girl. She's a anarcho barkist, an anarcho wooferist. No,
Anarcho Doge.
heck the police.
Propaganda.
Bork for justice.
Yeah, mine's been like assailing the neighbors through the glass door, trying to like I don't know what he knows who the neighbor is. He talks to him, or well, not talks to him, but barks at him and stuff all the time. But like when I have him out on walks, he just walks up to him and lets him pet. I don't get what goes through his head. It's like if he can't smell him, then he just freaks out at any kind of movement. I got a Jack Russell though, so they're
yeah. See, there you go.
But yeah.
So yeah, and I want to kind of maybe use this as a conduit to bring our discussion back to Moody's book. So I'm gonna to take a little bit of the religious inflections and kind of try to draw these threads together from what I can do on the fly here, which is I think it's that I think if maybe somebody can correct me here. It's that quote from Sinclair Lewis: "When fascism comes to the United States, it will be wrapped in a flag and carrying a cross." Which is to say, like absolutely none of this is to like dismiss the fact that like, religious institutions, particularly, of the Christian variety in the United States, are deeply imbricated with racism, reactionary politics, and settler colonialism. Like, in fact, that whole ideology was based on, civilizing the savage and all that, bringing, Christianity. So like again, these are not black and white issues, and we should be, mindful of all of those things and like really recognize that a lot of the kind of neo-fascist movement, particularly the ones that are developing here in the Pacific Northwest, like Patriot Prayer, they portray themselves as religious freedom fighters, so to speak. And like Patriot Prayer, I think, is a great example of what you would call exactly that embodiment of that Sinclair Lewis quote. But then I also want to suggest from a paraphrase, I guess, of Clara Zetkin's writing on fascism, which is that fascism is kind of the I'm really struggling to paraphrase her here. She says it's the punishment that the working class organization goes under for its revolutionary party failing to cohere and do its job, which is to say that in her context, she was writing in the aftermath of World War I, and the fascists were cohering around this disaffection with social democratic politics because, for example, the German Social Democrats had voted for war credits and gotten totally alienated the working class by leading them into an imperialist bourgeois war. And so the fascists fed off of that disillusionment with the direction of the kind of the bourgeoisification of social democratic politics. And I think that's why, again, and this is where I'll come back to Moody, this is why I'm so insistent myself, and Moody is too, but I think to a lesser extent that I am, that working within the framework of the Democratic Party is a short-term, very short-sighted rather strategy, which sacrifices long-term working class political independence for short-term getting into political office in a context wherein the right is on the rise. The right within the parliamentary system in the United States, such as it is very much dominant, even if it's the right wing of the Democrats and also the Republicans and Trump and so on. So even with more kind of progressive or social democratic politicians in power, I really stress the need for organizing directly outside of the system. And I personally, as a Leninist, as somebody who believes in that kind of vanguard party, the self-organized militant minority, cohering itself into a force that will be part of the working, that is part of the working class, an organic part of the working class, but also able to provide real organic leadership to that class. The issues of class and party are intrinsically interlinked. So that's where I come at this from, is the place of how do we form a national, eventually a national and coherent organization that is able not only to, push the capitalists, seize the workplaces and push the, capitalists out of power, but also then to dismantle the imperial state, the bourgeois state, and all these, and repress the reaction to the revolution. These are the big long-term questions that we have to be thinking about here that are, I think Kyle and Izzy and I were all in our 20s and 30s, so these are questions we're going to be still probably grappling with when we're all Yousseff's age.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, basically goes back to I think what laborkyle said earlier, 2 or 3 pronged approach to this issue. Work within the party, work outside the party, and create a working class movement and move forward. And in the meantime, as situation worsens, we can also hope for the revolution at the same time.
I completely agree, and I think Melody. I actually think both of you really hammered in on a significant part of I think what makes Moody's book effective is that he presents those like almost Leninist critiques. He presents several Leninist critiques throughout.
Moody's very much a Leninist. He's, I think, associated with Solidarity. I think they're kind of a Trotskyist adjacent group, so definitely of the kind of the Leninist stripe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found that because he presents critiques of spontaneity in a very sort of what is to be done kind of way.
Absolutely.
And I very much appreciate the way that he is essentially. We can use the binary of cutting a path between, call it a Marxist-Leninist or a Leninist engagement in terms of party politics, and then thinking about the new left after the 1960s and the 70s. That actually may be too simple. He may be formulating his own ideas outside of that binary. But you brought up the interwar period, and I think that's really important because really, like one of the most important Marxist writers to come out of Europe ever, but especially in that period, Gramsci was engaging and struggling with the rise of fascism, he was struggling with the engagement. He is just struggling to engage with the not shift out of capitalism into socialism that was happening, and instead was trying to figure out exactly what are the ways in which that not just this mode of production, but how are we also culturally reinforced? How is this all culturally reinforced and exchanged among not just the bourgeoisie, but among working people as well? It's part of what I think the New Left managed to actually do fairly well, which is what Moody is referencing, this bottom-up idea. And what I really like about that is that it's not exactly aligning itself to a purely syndicalist call it like an orthodox syndicalism, a Kropotkin literalist or whatever. Like I don't know if any of that exists. But
anarcho-fundamentalist.
Exactly.
Oh dear God.
He's instead sort of doing the harder thing, right? Which is grappling with the problem that we have, which is like a problem of leadership and a problem of numbers. We don't really have the leadership. We're building it right now. Like those of us who are having these conversations with each other, I think are building ourselves to be leaders in terms of organizing, as well as in this sort of imagined either party structure or connection of labor union structure, or however we're looking at it. As well as we don't have the numbers in order to be able to sustain and promulgate that ideology right now. So we're running up into and I experience this a lot in terms of practical organizing, we're running into a burnout problem right now because there's all of this like movement and not enough people to sort of like push it forward. So what it seems that like the sort of bottom up, when I think of bottom up approaches, I go to historiography instantly. I go to essentially the study of historical writing, and I think about E.P. Thompson, and I think about other members of the Communist Party Historians Group. It's all probably just because I published an article on this, but it's very fresh. But I think it sort of cuts to how their approach to history, which was, it was literally called history from below. While that's not a perfect methodology or anything, in principle, it was always in a very, very good place. because what it was refusing to do was it was constantly trying to recognize individual agency of individual people. It makes sense in the context of our conversation around religion as well. It's trying to not be too structural. You can absolutely still examine social structural inequalities, socio-structural oppression in the context of class, and it's still all very Marxist to me. However, what it is saying we have to recognize the way that individual actors play a role in all of this stuff. So I see it very effectively, and in a way that feels reflective of my own views in a lot of way, attempting to reconceptualize all of these ideas around increased organizing and trade unionism, around the mass mobilization of a party, like a workers' party, and a vanguard to lead that party. It's essentially trying to assemble all of these different ideas into something that's new, because if we know based off of the book, all of this shit is changing quite a bit through changing the composition of the bourgeoisie, as well as in the composition of the working class, our modes of engagement, the mode of production, all of the shit that's constantly changing and moving around. Essentially, capital is doing its own Fabian strategy, and then the working class follows the Fabian strategy, because that's just the way that until we're able to ultimately start dictating the conversation, we're still going to be sort of like reactive as opposed to active.
Yeah.
So I guess all of that is just to say that I appreciate this sort of I don't want to call it non-sectarian, but in general, it really is like a sort of a more pluralist view on potential for left-wing engagement in the 21st century. And I think that's just really valuable. And I also think it's literally the only choice we have, so we should probably do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, though. So.
Yeah.
I need to interject that VV has the best comment of the night, with anarcho-fundamentalists only use black spray paint for their graffiti.
Any anarchist who uses anything other than black spray paint is now gets exiled off to Siberia with you.
Cranston's killing it in chat. She's so funny.
Yeah. So, what Kyle just brought up, I think, and also really, situating ourselves kind of historically here, which is that, our socialist movement, and trying to be inclusive here, I'm including anarchists in that. I'll just say revolutionary socialist movement, because that's my umbrella term. It's got some baggage with it, but I consider, Marxist Leninists, anarchists, etc. We're all revolutionary socialists. We fundamentally believe that capitalism has to be transformed. We can't just reform our way. We can't just legislate our way out of capitalism. The working class has to seize power. That's, I think, the fundamental distinction between revolutionary strains of socialist politics and reformist ones. And our comrade here, Captivating Cat, says we have to start somewhere, and I think that's actually really important, and that's why I tend to take I wouldn't call it non-sectarian, because I have my prejudices about this, but we are, especially our generation of folks we're in our teens, 20s, and 30s right now, and the younger generation who are obviously kind of being forced to develop political consciousness because we live in such drastic, awful times, which is that we are starting from scratch as far as independent working class institutions go in the United States anyway. In that we are rebuilding these labor unions from the ground up. We are rebuilding the possibility of militant protest from the ground up. Right, these just the day and night contrast between the very militant protests of the inauguration protests back in 2017, and then the day after that, the very liberal women's march. Again, there were definitely good things to be said about the women's march too, but there's just day and night contrast between this uprising from below of not afraid to take some less than legal actions and confront police and so on, and the very kind of kowtowy attitude of the more liberal mass march kind of thing, wherein the march is more of a like performative photo op than it is an actual like action to affect change, right? Like these are nothing like the mass civil rights movement back in the 60s, even with its liberal dimension, right? Like they were still illegally occupying spaces and like going on strike and all these things that were like not state sanctioned at all, and not etc. So I got kind of off on a little tangent there, but and Youseff is out giving his dog some playtime, so he'll be absent for a short while here. But I just wanted to say thank you everyone who's joined us for this stream so far. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. Be sure to go and subscribe to all of our channels. Izzy Does Everything, laborkyle, and my channel, of course, is A World to Win. And we're gonna keep talking here for at least a little while longer if folks are wanting to engage with that. Yeah, I think just no matter what, and I'm kind of responding to the comments that I'm seeing on our live chat here, which is that Jay Dornier says we have to work with and learn from each other. Absolutely. I draw from all kinds of revolutionary socialist traditions. I read anarchist stuff to inform my theory. It's not that I'm just like an eclectic who thinks you can take from wherever you want, but like frankly, I'm not going to make very intelligent engagements with my anarchist comrades in struggle if I'm not informing myself on their theory and strategy. And like furthermore, they have some really great ideas that I think are worth for any revolutionary socialist to take up. And I think the same is true of, I talk to anarchists who have read a bunch of, Lenin and Mao and so on, and they, even if they reject ultimately a lot of that theory, they're still engaged with it and still learning from it. And then Ken Key says, being an anarchist, I recognize that socialism is what will unite all left wing. Not everyone wants to abolish the state. Your strategy is right on point. Yeah, and I think and that's maybe where Moody leads us to some interesting forks in the road there about, and this is what I struggle with talking about the state, the like capital T, capital S, the state, because, as a Leninist, I think that you need to abolish the capitalist state and establish, using those institutions, those workers' councils, those union institutions that you formed in the course of struggle, as Moody quotes Gramsci. Those are the kind of the primordial pieces of the proletarian state, right? So that's how I come at that. Anarchists tend to say, no, that's bad. Those become ossified power structures unto themselves. And again, I'm engaging in a little bit of caricature because I'm not super familiar with these arguments, but the anarchists who I've talked to have said something to that effect, that those power structures that supplant the capitalist state kind of gain their own autonomy as institutions of power. And that's not a critique I'm prepared to engage with in depth here, but anyhow. But I think Moody really, like, the critical part of this, and this is where maybe I diverge from Moody, or maybe it's just a matter of Moody's framing, which is that this is a very U.S. European centric book, and he doesn't pretend otherwise. Like he's not trying to say that this has like universal applicability. It's just something we really need to engage with, which is that fundamentally the role of the state, and as a Leninist, this is really what I focus in on, is the role of the U.S. bourgeois state is one that is committed to imperialist world order. And really, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, the US has become a fucking monolith of military imperial power. The US spends more on its military than, I think, the next 5 major countries combined, including China and India, which also have massive militaries.
Yes.
You know, so like, again, and I think this is the biggest weakness of the kind of social democratic progressive so-called left, is that, you know, this is magically absent from their argument. This is why I argue that, you know, social democracy in this sense is still fundamentally a chauvinist ideology, because it obfuscates the contradictions of imperialism. You know, it's just, you know, President Bernie gives us all, you know, free healthcare and free college and whatnot, but he still keeps bombing the living daylights out of, you know, Syria and the rest of the world. Like, what does it fucking count for? Like, what about the working class in the global south? What about the working class in, you know, Brazil, where they're dealing with the fascist Bolsonaro? Like, fundamentally, the problem for me of the biggest contradiction of so-called social democracy is that of its inability to destroy that system of global domination and imperialism. And I think that gets obfuscated a lot in this conversation, because we really, especially during election season, that kind of exerts a giant rightward center of gravity on the entire discussion. Not just like, because so even if we're further down on the left, on the anarcho-communist side, on the Leninist side, on the Maoist side, etc., even if we are in that, even if we are responding with our correct, like, analysis, which says that we need to be addressing these things, we are still fundamentally within the, like, the, whatever you want to call it, the framing of that as the political moment, and having to combat the opportunism of these oh man, I'm getting really salty, these opportunist charlatans of
Continue.
neo-Kautskyism, we'll call it, or neo-Bernsteinism, that really the focus for me on imperialism and its role in this stage of capitalism is something that, you know, we really need to engage with and address, because, like, and I remember this happened, maybe, you know, Kyle and Youseff probably remember this better, but, you know, I remember one of the biggest things I remember as a kid was, I'm 26, and one of the biggest things I remember as a kid was everyone was pissed about the Iraq War. There's some of the biggest protests in U.S. history, and then by the time the 2004 election came around, there was no fucking anti-war movement anymore. And by the time Obama got elected, there was like none, like absolutely none. And, you know, that's kind of exactly what I fear with this whole move towards electoralism and kind of like over investment in figures like AOC and Bernie and you know, Ilhan Omar and stuff. It's again, like, it's not about their individual characters as, like, you know, politicians, which I think is still how a lot of leftists are framing it. But that's a trap to me. I think going back to Moody here and really focusing on the structural features of how the Democratic Party and the bourgeois state are these interconnected systems of power that are really designed to be release valves of our, you know, militant energy. I think that's really how we have to think about this, and I've gone on long enough, so I'll let y'all respond.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Because I'm looking at the section in my notes that just says, "What is it missing?" Which is essentially just portions of the book that I thought could have maybe used something. There's additional evidence that would not change his conclusions necessarily, but that would definitely help leverage them in a more meaningful and totalizing way. And the main one that I thought about was essentially Marxist theories of imperialism. I think about theories of accumulation and surplus from within that space. That would be Luxemburg, I think.
Lenin.
Exactly. The idea that and you know, to his credit, Hobson.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bukharin and Lenin, like, I think there is a missing link in terms of two parts of that. One, just in general, the idea of resource extraction as a principle, both from within and without. So in terms of imperial holdings, as well as resource extraction from the tiny little micro colonies in the United States, be it extraction in the form of labor from low income and poor communities, particularly communities of color, or in terms of actual demonstrable resource extraction from places like Appalachia, essentially going in, cutting off the top of a mountain, sucking all the good stuff out of it, and then essentially taking all of those resources to a metropole. Those were not reinvested in those communities, and those communities struggle a lot nowadays, specifically because of the same principles of resource extraction. And on the second half of things, it's the legacy of settler colonialism in the United States that I think also reinforces those ideologies of extraction and repression within the context of an additional gradation of the working class. We could call it the global South. We can call it a continuous global South within the context of those who could be classified within that category from within the United States due to the level of exploitation and extraction, or those outside of it as well. So I think that's really, really important part that's maybe kind of missing within the context of this book. And then as well as and the problem is that if you do too much historicizing, then as I said earlier, it's going to be a 1,500-page long book. You can't talk about everything.
Yeah.
He chose sources that were helpful and useful to his argument, and that had sort of the most immediate benefit that he could have, which was this sort of quantitative, almost political science kind of analysis, as well as economics. And so his historicizing is weak, but not. I don't think because he doesn't know history.
Not
he
to a fault, though. Certainly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly.
So,
and so there's a gap in terms of imperialism and settler colonialism, as well as I would say the nation state too, because this is what we're all referencing, right? Like the nation, as long as the nation in the way that it exists is preserved in terms of its demarcations of, say, difference, right? So say an Occidental versus an Oriental, an in and out or whatever. It's going to have that preserving quality when it comes to foreign policy, to where regardless of the level of anti-imperialist critique from within the context, which right now, out of all the people that you mentioned, Ilhan Omar is the only one who barely offers that. The other ones do not offer an anti-imperialist critique
Certainly
at all.
Not.
And it's my biggest criticism of them. It doesn't work, I know exactly what you mean.
So I have to interject here. Youseff has been so kind as to be hosting this talk here, but I'd like to also respect his space and his time here. So I think we're at 6:52. Would you be okay if we wrapped up at 7?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So let's just take a quick thank you so much again to our audience here. You can thanks for tuning in, and you can help support us and our channels by sharing this live stream on your social media, on Facebook, Twitter, whichever you think is you have the best reach on. Talk to your friends and comrades and family about the issues that we brought up here. And I guess to wrap things up, I guess we'll just do a quick go round of closing thoughts, and I'll let Youseff. Do you want to start us off there?
My closing thought would be regarding the imperialism. With the after World War II, with the emergence of a what we economists call duopoly, but call it bipolar world, leading to the fall of the Soviet Union and led to a unipolar world. But I think that has already ended. I think we are in the beginning of a multipolar world. And this is very similar to a situation we were at, right, going to World War One.
Absolutely.
So now we have, say, America. So obviously I'm saying the America's unique superpower status is dwindling, is about to weaken, as China, EU, and of course broken away from UK, let's say Russia India. They're jockeying for position. This, on one hand, is very good because it keeps America's supreme power in check. But on the other hand, can be very terrifying.
All of these countries have nukes.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we are in the beginning of the early stage of multipolar world, and no one for sure can tell where is this heading, and that is, in my opinion, very scary.
Yeah.
Crusade doesn't win.
Yeah. Kyle or Izzy, do you want to go next for closing thoughts?
Izzy, go for it.
Oh, yeah. Shit. I was totally not expecting him to just like hand it off like that.
We can come back to you. We can come back to you.
It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Let me just recollect where my head was a minute ago. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was just gonna say how electoral politics tend to contribute to a sort of cult of personality phenomenon when it comes to left-leaning figures, a lot more than it does on the right, because they just seem to congeal together. But when it comes to exceptionally left-leaning figures on the left in politics, at least with the Overton window we're saddled with right now, and left-leaning figures in that context tend to develop a cult of personality amongst left-leaning liberals and kind of like rad libs and stuff like that, and some leftists who are leaning a little more that way, and we have that camp, and then we have another camp altogether who are just screaming for the boogaloo to go down. And the problem is we can't seem to get any kind of intersection between those two and find some kind of compromise with which to work and build a labor movement. And that's what I've gotten out of this conversation, with some of the things being brought up, especially in the chat. The chat's been amazing tonight.
Yes.
And hold on one sec. Yeah. Yeah. But no, I blanked. Yeah.
Kyle, you should go for it. And Izzy, if something comes back to you, just go ahead and go for it.
Yes, seriously, Izzy, by all means. In terms of my takeaways from the conversation, first of all, to echo chat, y'all are killing it. Big points, small points. Francine, I see your chats, and I think you're absolutely right. I would go into it more, but we don't have time. But just to let you know, I completely agree. And we are sort of reared in similar contexts as well in terms of the South, because I know where you live, what state you live in, I mean. I think that's absolutely true. I know that sounded scary. What's
your favorite scary movie?
Down with the creepy left.
No creepy left, just weird left. She's in my we're Twitch friends.
Oh, right on.
But in terms of takeaways from the conversation, I'm left with similar feelings that I had before. I found Moody to be refreshing in a lot of ways, but was ultimately confirming some of the preconceptions I had about engaging on the left in the 21st century that I'd had before, and good for me and my instincts or whatever, but or my politics or whatever the fuck you want to think it is. But what I think it means is that there's this sort of space that we have between what was going on in terms of working class politics throughout the 20th and even the 19th century, but mostly the 20th century, especially after the late 1970s, after Jimmy Carter, and into the 1980s with Reagan in the United States, to where not only are shifts happening more quickly in terms of the composition of, or the way that we conceptualize the working class, to reference an earlier point that we brought up, but also the way that capital is reforming and reshaping itself, that I don't know if we're going to catch up, because I don't know if that's how things work. But what I do know is that the continued elevation of class consciousness among ourselves, the people in our lives, appears to be the fundamental basis. If we're talking about bottom up, socialism, the fundamental basis for this is the ways in which we are engaging as individual historical actors. The takeaway from this conversation for me is the takeaway that I always think about whenever I think about talking about politics with people who maybe aren't as actively engaged in terms of, say, IRL organizing, or who maybe aren't even engaged in terms of reading or understand sort of humanistically that we deserve a better world without having all the, jargony about a theory crap to, back it up or whatever. First of all, you're still right, even without reading a whole bunch of Lenin, like you're reading a whole bunch of Marx, reading Capital, you're absolutely still right.
Yeah.
And your most important and significant role in all of this is trying to figure out a way that you can engage in your regular life with the people who are close to you, with the people you know, with the people who are maybe receptive to your politics, and help them develop their own class consciousness and to make an organizer out of them. It's my number one priority in my life. I'm okay at converting reactionaries. I'm okay at converting libs. I've always been okay with that. But what I always really like to do is teach. I taught 7th grade for a little while. I've taught undergraduate students, lectured for undergraduate students, I should say, and done that sort of a grading. And the thing that we do in history is we're constantly trying to make new historians because they're trying to cut our funding all the time. So we need people to go to our graduate programs. We need people to major in history. But also because it is by far, I grew up around evangelical Christians. I'm not religious anymore, but as a result of this, go to church 3 days a week. Everyone in the family volunteers. Like, you're always at fucking church. What I did learn to come to understand is that the way to engage with individual people and to make them receptive to your ideas is to create spaces for them that let them know that they're loved, that they're cared for, and that they're needed. Like, we need you in order to be able to make all of this stuff work. And
Absolutely.
That is the brass tacks fundamentals of organizing on the left, is that we need human beings. So we can wall ourselves off as much as we can. Some of us don't have a choice. I totally understand that in terms of ability. But when we do that and we occupy only one space, say the online space, say the theoretical space, without pushing into the IRL space or the space of praxis, if you will, we're not actually going to be able to convert people to our ideas.
Sure.
So at the end of the day, what Moody tells me is that my chosen mode of engagement, so long as it has the goal of building and developing class consciousness in others, is going to have in some way a good effect on the things that are happening. Now, that's not a universal truth, but what it does is it complicates our ideas whether or not we need to be building the revolutionary working class party or if we need to, be organizing our workplace.
Sure.
For me right now, the most effective thing I can be doing is helping comrades around me organize their workplaces and learn about labor unions.
Sure.
Which, by the way, if you need advice or anything on that, I'm not an absolute expert on it, definitely not, but I have a lot of friends who are actual real labor organizers for unions and stuff. You just go to Twitter and you send me a DM and you say, hey, I work here, I don't know what the hell to do. Reach out, let me know, let all of us know, and I'm sure we would be willing to do our best to try and plug you into the resources that you need to try and make some of this shit happen.
Okay.
And then the very, very, very final thing, I apologize for going on for too long, is that just 2 quick things. One, this is a very accessible book. Sometimes it gets a little wonky in terms of numbers in the beginning when he's talking more actively about economy. But if you take it slow through those sections, you can really not just understand what he's talking about in this book. It just about anybody could, but it really gives you an idea about the idea. It really gives you an understanding of the idea of Marxist principles around capital accumulation, which is a big part of the first volume of Capital. It's a big part of his thought in general, and it relates to all of his other stuff. Yeah. So oftentimes the best way to engage with Marxist writing may not be to read Marx himself, at least not yet. Read a secondary source like this. This is a great example that engages with those arguments in an interesting, effective way, and one that works with contemporary issues as well. There's stuff in here that you remember. There's stuff in here that you were alive to experience. Yeah. All of that stuff. So it's a good book. Chat, I love you. Comrades on the stream, y'all are the best. Okay. This is ruled. End of speech.
Thank you, Kyle. I gotta wrap things up here. So thank you again to Youseff for providing the space and your lovely self.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you to Izzy and Kyle and also Simba, despite the fact that Comrade couldn't make it, still did the work. Hopefully, they'll be able to join us next time. I really hope that we can all do this again. My takeaways here, and again, I'm trying to be as brief as I can, which is what I got out of this discussion is that this is a great format. I maybe I'm premature in saying that. Maybe I'll eat those words at some point. But I really think this is what I've set out with my channel, A World to Win, to do is to be a kind of an amateur historian slash propagandist and talk about this stuff in this kind of forum where we have between the four of us. I'd say with the exception of Youseff, none of us are experts in.
I'm not expert.
Well, but you have a PhD.
We're all students.
But yes,
We're
no,
all
that's
students.
exactly my point. Is we're all students of struggle here, right? None of us is an expert. We're all learning together, and we're all understanding our strengths and deficits, and that is fundamentally like the lesson that if you're watching this either on live chat right now or if you're listening to this later when it comes out as a free floating video, that I hope that what you take from this conversation is not simply the content itself, but also the form. Like doing a Skype chat with some folks across the country is fantastic, but do this with your comrades, do this with your friends, sit down with, either On New Terrain or another book that you're interested. Maybe it's a more difficult book like Capital, or, an anarchist book like Modern Science and Anarchy, or some other text. It doesn't even have to be a dense theoretical book. You could all get together and read, an inspiring revolutionary story together, and that can kind of be the put some fire in your belly and give you some hope. But like, yeah, so if you're interested in continuing this conversation, be sure to subscribe to all of our channels. And I think all three of us are on Twitter. That's how we all met, in fact, I think. So follow us on Twitter. I'm at A World to Win 1. Izzy is at Izzy the Fox, FAWKES, I think. And Kyle is, I think, at laborkyle. Is that right?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, you can drop those in the live chat if you want. So I'll just wrap up by saying thank you to everyone who shared our promoted the link to this stream on Twitter or social media. I hope that you got something out of the conversation, and I hope that you continue to follow all of our content and hope that you are able to apply what you've learned in the practical struggle out there in good old real life. And I hope that whatever your political persuasion, that this kind of thing convinces you of the need to engage in struggle and to contribute and participate in the project of working class political education. So thank you very much for being with us, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.